In 1984, Warner Brothers and Amblin Entertainment gave us one of the greatest Christmas films of all time. I'm of course talking about the holiday horror comedy classic Gremlins. These days, it has become such an iconic part of pop culture, especially for horror fans, that it's hard to imagine that it could have gone any other way. Its creation seems pretty straightforward, and yet the path it took to completion was anything but. Gremlins began as a writing draft by screenwriter Chris Columbus as a speculative script to show that he was capable of writing one, and as such was never intended to be made into a film. The idea for it came to him one night while sleeping in his loft, as he said that the place he was living at the time was infested with mice, and hearing them skittering around in the blackness was actually really creepy. Despite not being specifically designed to be made into a film, it ended up catching the attention of a certain filmmaker, Steven Spielberg, who decided to buy it as he said it was the most original idea he had seen in a long time. The earliest surviving version readily available online is the second draft that Chris Columbus wrote in 1982. While still recognizable as Gremlins, this early version deviates significantly from the final version and is a much darker take on the story. From this point on, I will summarize this draft and compare it to the final version to see how it evolved over the years prior to the filming process. The beginning of the draft is pretty close to the version we get, except for some location changes. In the final film, Rand Peltzer purchases the Mogwai from a shop in Chinatown in New York City, while in the draft, it's actually in Hong Kong. Another difference is that in this version, the old man is the one who sells it to him without explaining any of the rules, which gives him a much more sinister demeanor than the final version, where the character now called Mr. Wing refuses to sell the Mogwai to Rand as he believes that he's irresponsible. We also learn the meaning of the word Mogwai as Rand asks a stewardess about it on the flight back and is disturbed to learn that it means devil in Cantonese. A huge change is that here the name Gizmo is never actually used in the script, and he's actually no different from any of the other Mogwai. And of course, we don't learn the meaning of the word ever in the final film. From here, the scene changes to Kingston Falls. In the early draft, this is a town in Pennsylvania as opposed to New York in the final product. We then cut to the bank scene, which plays out pretty much the same way as the final version, except for a couple of major changes. For one, the sequence with Barney the dog doesn't actually happen, and there's a security guard named Gary. It's pretty clear that this character eventually evolved into Gerald in the final version, although he has a much bigger role here. Gary is also the brother of the sheriff in this version, so he seems to have been a character that was divided into several other characters in the final version. Another change is that the character of Kate, played by Phoebe Cates in the final film, here is called Tracy. She's mostly the same, except the Gary character is her jealous boyfriend, or at least he thinks he is. Billy's nearly identical to the final version, except for one major difference. Here, he's a massive fantasy fan and an aspiring author, which becomes major aspects of the story going forward, whereas in the final film, he's more of an aspiring comic book artist. That's a plot point that doesn't really go anywhere. Most of the supporting characters are very similar to the final versions, especially Mrs. Deagle, although here her husband plays a minor role. After the bank scene concludes, Billy drives home and picks up a friend along the way. This is Pete, who was played by Corey Feldman in the finished film. Here he talks about the book he's writing and stops off at an antique store along the way run by Dory, an old man who plays a pretty significant supporting role in the draft. At the antique store, it is revealed that Billy has purchased a replica of an 11th century longsword, which plays an extremely pivotal role in the story going forward and really helps illustrate the fantasy aspects. The sword actually makes its way into the finished version in a way, but is only used in one short action sequence, and beyond that is mostly used as a gag. The character of Dory is referenced in the film as presumably the owner of Dory's Tavern, although he never actually makes an appearance. Billy gets home, we're introduced to his mother, the volume-popping Lynn Peltzer, and Barney, their dog, who in this version is an Irish setter. Billy and his mom get along really well in the finished film, but here they get into an argument almost immediately because Billy thinks that he's too old to be living at home and wants to move out and get his own place, when his dad comes home with a gift for him. This scene plays out very similar to the final version, except we don't have the sword falling off the wall since it's in Billy's room. Gizmo, who's never actually named in this script and simply called the Mogwai, appears here, and we see the biggest departure from the final product begin to unfold. In this draft, Mogwai, as he's called, is not the friendly, cuddly character we came to love, but instead he's portrayed as being as devious and sinister as any other of his kind. In fact, all of the Mogwai are identical in this version, as the reproduction is seen as a form of budding that produces an exact replica of the original, more of a cloning process than a birthing one, which actually makes a lot more sense considering the asexual nature. Billy and the Mogwai don't get along at all in the early draft, and there's actually quite a bit of tension between them, which almost serves to give the Mogwai motivation for the events that follow, as Billy's actually quite mean to him in a couple of scenes. The reveal that they can reproduce via contact with water happens almost the same, with Pete coming over to talk to Billy about a fantasy story and then discovering the Mogwai and asking if he can borrow him. During the scene, a water bottle gets knocked over and the Mogwai gets wet, which of course causes him to multiply. Being the genius he is, Billy sprays one again to see if he's hallucinating, which results in several more, of course. The scene with the biology teacher plays out close to the final one, except it takes place in Billy's house instead of the school, and the teacher surprisingly survives this version, at least as far as we know. We also get the added revelations that they can't bud if their environment is below 25 degrees Fahrenheit, which explains why the snow seems to have no effect on them, and that they are attracted to sources of fresh water and will actively seek them out. We also discover that they have a very intense social bond towards one another that compels them to stay together in a group, which also plays a pretty big role in the script, but also helps explain sequences in the movie, such as the tavern and the theater scenes where it seems that all of the gremlins have congregated into one area. Billy's dad finds out about the Mogwai reproducing and immediately attempts to market it, thinking that every household will want one, in a similar reaction to the one he has in the final film. From this point, the draft and the film diverged pretty drastically. While the final version took a much more lighthearted and comical approach, the script goes on a far darker path. Billy awakes in the middle of the night to hear noises coming from downstairs. Of course, he goes to investigate to discover to his horror that the Mogwai have killed Barney and are feasting on his body under the Christmas tree. Of course, in the final version, this does not happen. The Mogwai eat chicken instead, although poor Barney does get strung up outside with Christmas tree lights, which serves to show the malicious nature of the Mogwai. Naturally, Billy wants to destroy them right away after discovering they've killed his dog, but his father decides to lock them up in the attic and deal with them in the morning, complaining he has to get up early for work. They go up in the morning to find that the Mogwai have cocooned themselves in metallic pods that essentially prove to be indestructible. These differ quite a bit from the versions shown in the finished film, which always kind of reminded me of apple fritters. In the original draft, they seem to be more along the lines of the seed pods seen in Invasion of the Body Snatchers. The biology teacher returns to make us question his credentials by proclaiming that the Mogwai have now entered a larval state, and then states the obvious that they are in the process of metamorphosis. In the film version, this is corrected by stating that they have entered the pupal stage. Billy and his father go to work to leave the poor mom alone with the cocoons. Billy stands up to Mrs. Deagle, literally telling her off in much harsher language than we'd see in the final film, to the applause and admiration of everyone at the bank, including Tracy, although his boss isn't quite as amused and promptly fires him. He then gets a call from his mom and frantically attempts to get home, but can't due to the wintry road conditions. His mom goes upstairs to investigate after hearing a loud noise, but in a major twist is ambushed by the newly hatched Gremlins, who here take on a much more devilish appearance, with a long tail that lashes back and forth and horns replacing the oversized ears of the early Mogwai. Billy finally gets home and discovers the dead body of his mother. He manages to get to the sword in his room, and a violent bloodbath ensues, with Billy hacking and slashing his way through the majority of the Gremlins. Some of this makes its way into the final film, as this is actually the point where we get the famous kitchen scene, and the sequences involving the blender and the microwave gremlin deaths play out here, although it's Billy doing it instead of his mother. In the final version, this is the only major time that the sword is used, as Billy arrives just in time to save his mother and decapitates the Christmas tree gremlin, whose severed head melts in the fireplace. However, that plays out slightly different this time, of course, because Billy's mother's already dead. As in the film, one gremlin escapes and Billy gives chase. In the final version, it's Stripe that survives, but in the draft, all of the Mogwai and Gremlins remain completely indistinguishable from one another. Although, unlike that version, the Gremlin here goes on his own little rampage, attacking a little girl and then gruesomely ambushing and killing Billy's friend Pete while he sings in the local caroling choir. This, of course, means that had this film been made as is, the Gremlins would have brutally killed a dog, Billy's mom, and then a kid, in this case Corey Feldman, in a matter of minutes. Starting to see why this draft didn't get made. Billy continues to chase after the Gremlin, who, just like the final film, manages to get to the YMCA and jump in the pool, resulting in hundreds of fully grown Gremlins to emerge and launch a full-scale assault on the town. Billy goes to the police, who of course don't take him seriously, but the deputy agrees to go with him and check out the YMCA building. He goes in to investigate alone, and unsurprisingly is killed. Billy manages to steal the police car and barely escape with his life. He tries to convince people that the Gremlins are real and coming for them, but no one believes him, and chaos ensues with numerous bloody deaths occurring. Some of this makes it into the final film, with numerous alterations. Of course, the violence is toned down or even played for comedic effect in some cases. Billy finds Tracy at her home trying to fight off a number of Gremlins, and he rescues her with his longsword, and the two of them set out looking for more survivors. The scene where Tracy fends off the Gremlins at her house is sort of reminiscent of the scene we get with Pete in the final film. The sheriff and his brother Gary go out to investigate after receiving a call from Billy, but their car crashes and the sheriff is killed. Billy manages to rescue Gary, however, which causes their rivalry over Tracy to continue as a subplot. Eventually, they make their way to the antique shop, and the owner Dory takes them in while the Gremlins destroy the town. It is here that we get the famous Santa Claus story from the final film, almost word for word, except now it's Dory who tells the story of his father's untimely demise. In the final film, it'd be Kate that tells this story. Tracy and Billy get closer to one another, which causes Gary's jealousy to grow. Billy believes that the Gremlins will try to make their way to the water tower on the outskirts of town to multiply again, which will result in them becoming a national threat. One huge departure here is that, of course, the early draft doesn't have Dory's Tavern, so as a result, of course, doesn't have the famous Gremlin pub scene. In the morning, the Force set out to try to find the Gremlins since they know they will all gather in the same place. They stop at a McDonald's to eat an extremely macabre scene that features murdered patrons strewn all over the restaurant, but reveals that not even the Gremlins will eat McDonald's as their food has been completely untouched. This is one of the only scenes of comedy in the original script, and as you can tell is far darker than the comedy we get in the final version. Just like the finished film, they discovered the Gremlins have taken refuge in the town movie theater, and the Force sneak inside to blow the theater up. Tracy turns on the projector and plays Snow White, which mesmerizes them long enough that the others can set up the trap. The film ends before they can blow the theater, and they are attacked by the Gremlins, who severely injure Dory. In the ensuing melee, Gary reveals his true nature and flees, leaving Tracy and Billy to fend for themselves. Billy lights the fire and drags Dory out of the theater while Tracy fights off the Gremlins with a steel pipe. They make it outside as the theater explodes, burning most but not all of them alive. However, Dory succumbs to his wounds. Tracy and Billy find Gary, and Billy accuses him of deserting them, and a fight breaks out between them. Gary gets the upper hand and manages to get a hold of Billy's sword and nearly kills him when he is pounced upon by the surviving Gremlins, who tear him to pieces. Billy grabs the sword, and the last two survivors get in the police car and drive away with a wounded Gremlin in the back seat. Tracy keeps the Gremlin pinned with the sword while Billy drives away from the water tower as the Gremlin lets out a pained screech to attract the surviving horde. Billy and Tracy stop to get gas as the Gremlins continue to pursue them in the distance. So this sequence where Billy and Tracy are driving a car with a wounded animal in the back seat that's calling out for its kin, and they stop at a gas station in the process. This is almost identical to the sequence in The Lost World when Ian Malcolm and Sarah Harding have the baby T-Rex in the back seat and it's calling out to the adult T-Rex in San Diego. And this could be a complete coincidence. However, considering both of these are Spielberg productions, I think this may have ended up in one of his other scripts. So anyway, the wounded gremlin manages to get free somehow and climbs into the car's engine, destroying the cables. Billy and Tracy manage to capture it again, this time putting it in a toolbox before running to a nearby greenhouse where the final battle takes place. Billy puts the toolbox down on a table, and at the center of a greenhouse there's a large tree that Billy and Tracy climb, but the gremlins manage to knock it down. Tracy's knocked unconscious as the tree falls, and Billy desperately attempts to protect her and himself from the violent horde. However, eventually he too is overwhelmed, but at the last second the sun rises, the lights amplified by the greenhouse, and it kills all of the gremlins, and they're saved. Billy wakes up in the hospital with his father standing over him, who informs him that Tracy is fine and recovering in a separate room, and all seems to be over when suddenly Billy realizes that the gremlin is still inside the toolbox and was shielded from the light. So then we cut to the greenhouse where we're seeing workers cleaning up debris. One of them notices the toolbox and decides to take it home. Along the way back, he hears rustling inside the box, which terrifies him, so he pulls over to the side of the road and he tosses the box over the side of the hill, which then tumbles down into a lake. And as the water begins to pour into the box, the film cuts to black and we hear the gremlins giggling as the credits roll. Of course, anyone who's seen the 1984 classic will know that quite a lot was changed in the final version that ended up being filmed, although many elements from this draft did make it into the finished film. The biggest change was the humorous tone, as well as the survival of most of the cast, including the mother, Barney the dog, and most importantly of all, the original Mogwai. Apparently, when they were designing the Mogwai that would become Gizmo, Steven Spielberg, who had recently helmed E.T. to Extraterrestrial, decided that the character was so cute that it needed to exist throughout the entire film, and so the script was altered to reflect this. This is apparently a fairly late change in the development of the film, as later scripts have Gizmo actually turning into Stripe. But now that Gizmo is going to survive the film and stay in his cute Mogwai form throughout, it became very clear that it was gearing itself towards a wider audience than previously anticipated. So, of course, a number of other changes were also made that would result in a much lighter tone overall. For the final film, Steven Spielberg chose Joe Dante to direct, as he had experience with horror films already, having directed the popular werewolf film The Howling several years prior. He began early phases of development of Gremlins while still serving as a director on another Spielberg project, the ill-fated Twilight Zone the movie. Having read the story The Gremlins, written by Roald Dahl in the 1940s for an unmade Disney film, Dante decided to infuse many ideas from that book into his finished film, which went a long way in developing the final product. The same story would serve as inspiration for the hugely influential Twilight Zone episode Nightmare at 20,000 Feet. Roald Dahl himself was inspired by urban legends that had surfaced during World War II about RAF pilots dealing with mechanical failures caused by small imp-like creatures, a point that was worked into the final film itself via exposition by Dick Miller's Mr. Futterman. This story also inspired a Bugs Bunny cartoon, 1943's Falling Hair. Famed Looney Tunes animator Chuck Jones himself actually has a cameo role in Gremlins as Billy's drawing mentor, who shows up for a brief scene at the very beginning of the movie while Billy is at Dory's Tavern. Funnily enough, Billy actually calls the character Mr. Jones here. Chuck Jones would come out of semi-retirement to direct the animated sequences for Gremlins 2 as well. And, of course, the Looney Tunes themselves would influence the way the Gremlins films would be changed overall, especially in Gremlins 2. Despite the many changes to the script, one scene remained more or less unaltered in almost all of them. This scene, of course, was the story about a father tragically dying on Christmas Eve while trying to bring his family Christmas joy. Although in the final version, it would be the female lead, Kate, that tells the story rather than the antique shop owner. Spielberg attempted to have this scene removed, but Dante refused as he stated that it encompassed the overall theme of the film. It remains a controversial moment to this day and has been cut from several subsequent broadcasts. The final film would be produced by longtime Joe Dante collaborator Michael Fennell, who first worked with him on 1976's Hollywood Boulevard, and the pair would continue to work together on such films as 1981's The Howling, 1989's The Burbs, and many others. It would be executive produced by Steven Spielberg, Kathleen Kennedy, and Frank Marshall. Active production on Gremlins began in early 1983, with filming taking place on Warner Brothers and Universal Studio lots in Burbank, California, from April 27th until July. The character of Tracy was changed to Kate Berenger, and actress Phoebe Cates was cast in the role, a controversial decision given her more risque previous roles. Her much more modest role in Gremlins allowed her to move into much less sexualized parts, and she would reprise the role in the 1990 sequel. Although she has retired from acting, she returned to the character once again to voice her in the 2015 LEGO Dimensions video game. The lead role of Billy Peltzer went to then unknown actor Zach Galligan, who described the role as a dream come true as he had a lot in common with the character, but got to do crazy things like blowing up movie theaters. Spielberg insisted on his casting, noting the chemistry that he and Kate shared in the audition process. His role in Gremlins is still his best known, and Galligan remains extremely proud of it, in this film as well as in its sequel, and seems to be directly involved in a third film should it ever actually materialize. Pete was played by up-and-coming child actor Corey Feldman, and his role was greatly expanded upon, with his fate ultimately becoming much less dire. Feldman also starred as Tommy Jarvis, a major character in the fourth installment of the classic slasher franchise Friday the 13th, which was released a few months earlier that same year, and of course would go on to have a role in a plethora of films later in the decade, including The Goonies and The Burbs. Rand Peltzer, Billy's father, played by Hoyt Axton, remains as one of the few characters that is left almost entirely unchanged from the early draft, apart from being given more clarification of his occupation as an inventor, which of course leads to many comical moments throughout the film, which weren't part of the initial draft. These include a number of Easter egg cameos from the likes of Steven Spielberg himself, and even Robbie the Robot, originally seen in 1956's Forbidden Planet, and also an appearance by H.G. Wells' Time Machine. Axton would also actually end up serving as the impromptu narrator of sorts for the beginning of the film after an introduction scene set in Chinatown, which also appears in the original draft, was cut from the final production. Billy's mom, Lynn, played by Frances Lee McCain, has a much better character arc in the final film, and not only survives the Gremlins' initial assault, but is given the extremely iconic kitchen fight sequence that would forever cement her as one of the great badasses of cinema alongside Ellen Ripley. By the 1980s, McCain was being frequently cast as mother roles and did so in such films as Back to the Future and Footloose, which was released earlier that year. The majority of the supporting cast were portrayed by various veteran character actors, with classic film and TV stars such as Dick Miller, who brings a bit of context to the title of the film with his story about the Gremlins legend while serving in WWII. His character, Mr. Futterman, who worked as a snowplow driver, was revealed to have been previously a worker at the local macaroni factory in a deleted scene. Although he seemingly met his demise at the hands of a gremlin after they commandeered his plow, he proved to be such a popular character that he returned in the sequel 5 years later. Interestingly enough, Dick Miller would also have a cameo appearance in James Cameron's The Terminator as the gun store owner. That film would be released in October of the same year. He was also a frequent collaborator with Roger Corman. The character of his wife Sheila was portrayed by another well-known character actress, Jackie Joseph, who is famous for her roles in numerous TV shows and films, including The Bob Newhart Show. Both Miller and Joseph also appeared together in 1960's Little Shop of Horrors, and would both have cameo roles in another Joe Dante film of a similar style to Gremlins, 1998's Small Soldiers. Polly Holliday portrayed the villainous Mrs. Deagle, a Scrooge-esque character that many people in the town despise. This character is virtually identical to the version that's found in the original draft, although the character of Mr. Deagle was completely removed from the final version. Billy's rival Gary would change into Gerald in the film version, and was portrayed by actor Judge Reinhold, who had previously worked with Phoebe Cates in the raunchy teen comedy Fast Times at Ridgemont High, which also starred a number of other up-and-coming actors, including Sean Penn, Forrest Whitaker, and even the first on-screen appearance by Nicolas Cage. While the character Reinhold portrayed had a much bigger role in the early draft of the film, he was greatly reduced. Even more so in the final version, as many of his scenes, along with the bank manager Mr. Corbin, played by Edward Andrews, would ultimately end up on the cutting room floor and exist only as deleted scenes. The biology teacher Roy Hansen would be played by actor Glyn Turman, who had made a name for himself in the 1970s, starring in a number of blaxploitation films. His character is one of the only examples who meets a much darker fate in the film than his draft counterpart, although he does have a slightly bigger role as well. The role of sheriff and deputy went to actors Scott Brady and Jonathan Banks, respectively. Brady made a career playing various characters in a number of westerns and police procedurals throughout the 1950s to 1970s. Sadly, this would be Brady's final film performance, as he passed away at the age of 60 the following year after a 4-year battle of pulmonary fibrosis. Banks, who had a role in Airplane and 48 Hours, would go on to also co-star in such films as Beverly Hills Cop alongside Judge Reinhold, and strangely enough, he was also an alum at Indiana University, Bloomington, where he was classmates with Phoebe Cates' real-life husband, Kevin Kline. The role of the Chinese shop owner, Mr. Wing, was given to Key Luke, a Chinese-American actor who got his start in cinema in the 1930s, starring in a number of films in the then-popular Charlie Chan franchise. His character is much more sympathetic in the final version, having refused to sell the Mogwai to Randall because he deemed him far too irresponsible, and returning at the end of the film to collect Gizmo. In the film version, Randall instead gets him from Mr. Wing's grandson, while in the early draft it is Wing himself, who remains unnamed, that not only sells the Mogwai but neglects to inform Randall of the rules that need to be followed, instead only informing him to keep him away from direct sunlight. The role of Dory is essentially removed completely from the final film, and his antique shop becomes a tavern, with the sword being taken out of the plot completely except for one short scene toward the beginning of the creature's rampage. Possibly the greatest casualty in the transition from script draft to film screenplay. And last but not least, the role of Barney went to Mushroom, who Steven Spielberg said was one of the best actors he had ever worked with. Of course, the character has a much greater role in the finished film, not only not serving as the post-midnight snack, a role that would be recast by a bucket of chicken instead, but he even takes a part in the climactic showdown against Stripe along with Gizmo. Mushroom would go on to have a role in Stan Winston's film Pumpkinhead 4 years later. The creature effects were done by using a mixture of puppetry, animatronics, stop motion, and even balloons, which were used to show the early stages of the Mogwai as they rapidly expanded from Tribble-like furballs into their fully developed juvenile states. The puppet designer was Chris Wallace, who had previously worked on such films as Piranha, Humanoids from the Deep, Dragon Slayer, Raiders of the Lost Ark, E.T., and most recently at the time, Return of the Jedi. The animatronics were notoriously difficult to work with, especially Gizmo. Numerous puppets and robots were designed with specific functions, but would frequently malfunction due to his small size. Wallace pleaded to design the Mogwai to be bigger, but Joe Dante refused, as it would take away from the cuteness factor that Spielberg had wanted. In fact, Gizmo proved so difficult to work with that the crew allegedly had a list of horrible things to do to him, which led to several scenes where the Gremlins terrorized the hapless Mogwai, including the dartboard scene in the tavern. Wallace would go on to provide effects work for films such as Enemy Mine and The Fly. While the original script featured completely identical Mogwai, the finished film would make each one slightly unique, not only in physical appearance but personality as well, and also give us a villain nearly as iconic as Gizmo himself, in the de facto leader of the Gremlins, Stripe. The concept of giving each Mogwai a distinct personality would be much further expounded upon in the sequel film, giving Stripe an easily recognizable physical feature that even carries into his metamorphosized form, allowed for a main villain that audiences could easily identify. He's also the Gremlin that's given the most distinctive personality and does have some very memorable moments, such as a chainsaw versus baseball bat duel with Billy near the film's climax that wasn't part of the original draft. Stripe, the Mogwai, and many of the Gremlins were brought to life by a combination of puppetry, animatronics, and the voice acting talents of Frank Welker, who has had an extremely prolific career as a voice actor in projects like Scooby-Doo, where he voiced Fred, as well as numerous other characters. His IMDb currently lists him as having 861 acting credits with no signs of stopping. Several other voice actors provided the voices for the remaining Gremlins. The role for Gizmo went to Canadian comedian Howie Mandel, who was urged to take the part by Welker. Most of the creature's lines were improvised by the voice actors based on cues within the scenes. In the early draft, the Mogwai don't speak at all, only giggle maniacally, so any dialogue was definitely a later addition. As the film became increasingly popular overseas, numerous dubs were made, with Mandel learning his lines in a number of different languages. The film's score, which utilizes many classic Christmas songs as well as featuring an iconic theme of its own, was composed by cinema maestro Jerry Goldsmith, whose impressive resume includes Star Trek, Alien, Planet of the Apes, Rambo, The Omen, and numerous others. He also makes a cameo in the film during the salesman convention sequence that featured many wacky moments in a similar vein to popular films of the time, such as Airplane. Despite the strong Christmas themes, Gremlins opened in summer, debuting in cinemas on June 8, 1984, the same day as another comedy horror film, Ghostbusters. Despite having strong competition, it was a massive success, grossing over $148 million domestically on a budget of $11 million in its original run. Despite being a commercial and largely critical success, it was not without its controversy. Perhaps the biggest controversy was actually the film's most important contribution to cinema. A major complaint dealt with the dark humor, violence, and horror themes that were present in the film, as the marketing had minimized the Gremlins and played up the holiday aspect and focused almost exclusively on Gizmo, which of course prompted many parents to take their young children to see it expecting something in line with E.T. The public outcry was enough that the MPAA ratings board had a review of their current system and determined that films such as Gremlins and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, which had been released the month prior, had too strong of themes for a PG rating, but not quite deserving of R, and so the PG-13 rating was born. The marketing for the film sold the idea of Gizmo to the general public, and the character became a household name and a merchandising phenomenon. In many ways, Gizmo was the original Baby Yoda, with numerous products including toys, lunchboxes, apparel, and games featuring the character. His appeal is so widespread that he's frequently seen on products all over the world, even today, with his face being common and recognizable sight in stores in places like Japan, even if consumers aren't really aware of where the character comes from anymore. There have been several video games based on the movie and its characters, including one of the earliest movie tie-ins, with games being released for both the Atari 2600 and 5200 around the time of the film's release, as well as several games for the Game Boy Color and DS that were released many years later. Most recently, the Gremlins were featured in 2015's LEGO Dimensions video game, which had crossovers with many other franchises, including DC, Doctor Who, and Jurassic Park. Gremlins proved to be so popular that a number of studios rushed similar themed creature flicks into production, with the most noteworthy being the Critters franchise, although the creators have repeatedly refuted this claim, stating the script was in development long before the release of Gremlins. Nevertheless, a wave of small monster films hit theaters in the subsequent years after the release of Gremlins, including Ghoulies, Trolls, Hobgoblins, and Munchies, to name a few. Eventually, Gremlins itself would get an official sequel entitled Gremlins 2: The New Batch in 1990, which brought back many of the original cast along with Joe Dante as the director. The sequel continues some of the themes while going off in a wildly different direction and taking a far more straightforward comedic approach, and similarly to the original, features a number of high-profile cameos and supporting roles, including Christopher Lee. Honestly, Gremlins 2 is probably deserving of its own retrospective. Although it has been more than 30 years since the last Gremlins film, we are currently living in a state of 80s nostalgia where many movies are getting soft reboots and sequels, and newer shows like Stranger Things continue to fuel the public's desire for everything from that decade. Gremlins is no exception, with talk of a Gremlins 3 production being a frequent topic on entertainment sites and a listing on IMDb for many years. But we may in fact be seeing a light at the end of the tunnel. Recently, an animated series titled Secrets of the Mogwai has been greenlit for HBO Max with a 2021 release date. Apparently, it will serve as a prequel to the original film, telling the story of Gizmo and Mr. Wing in 1920s China, and possibly featuring other Chinese myths as well. The show is run by Tse Chun, who has previously worked on series such as Once Upon a Time and Gotham. As for a direct sequel, Joe Dante and Chris Columbus have both been speaking more frequently about their potential ideas for a third film, and in fact, one does seem to be in early stages of development, with the very least Zach Galligan's involvement as a possible producer and likely star, ensuring that it would be in fact a sequel. One of many rumors made about this potential film is that Joe Dante is insisting that the creatures be brought to life via practical effects and is very much opposed to CGI. One needs to only watch The Mandalorian to see that the field of practical effects has indeed improved over the last 3 decades. Also, perhaps most interestingly, Dante has also stated that he would like to take an even darker approach to this film, so we could possibly see the R rating that the original draft would have clearly received had it been made. Will such a film ever be made? Only time can tell. However, with an HBO Max animated prequel in development, now seems the most likely time for it. Personally, I believe that had Chris Columbus's original draft been adapted, it would have made for a fantastic horror film. But the thing is, the 80s had many fantastic horror films, and while it is possible that Gremlins would have been a cut above many of the others, I think it is also more likely that it would have been a film that had potential to be lost in the sea of other horror projects. The dark humor infused into the project by Joe Dante and others, as well as the marketing prowess of Spielberg, helped craft Gremlins into something unique and truly special that has stood the test of time, and propelled it into the realm of a true classic. For me, Gremlins has and likely always will be the ultimate Christmas movie. There's just so many iconic moments, and the effects are so well done that it makes you forget that the film is over 35 years old. Thinking back on it, this film may have had more of an impact on me growing up than almost any other movie with the possible exception of Jurassic Park. Despite horror being my favorite genre these days, when I first saw the movie, I was very young, and I remember the scene when the Gremlins first emerged from the cocoons absolutely terrified me. So I can understand the complaints many parents had at the time, but at the same time, I was so fascinated by everything else that it drew me into the film and made me want to watch more. Prior to Gremlins, I was already a big fan of Star Wars, classic Godzilla, and 50s monster movies, which were frequently on TV at the time. But I had never seen anything quite like Gremlins, and despite my initial reaction, I can safely say that this film was my gateway into the wider world of horror cinema. And my love for the genre was born the moment those little green monsters revealed themselves for the very first time. If you've seen Gremlins, let me know what you think of it in the comments below, and if you haven't, I would urge you to check it out, especially during the holiday season. If you're as much of a fan of 80s horror as me, then I guarantee you won't be disappointed. Even if you aren't, Gremlins has so much to offer that it makes it enjoyable for practically anyone. So I hope you enjoyed my first ever movie retrospective. This was a lot of fun to make, and I hope to make more of them in the future, maybe even revisiting this movie again down the line. Merry Christmas, everyone, and thanks for watching. Bye.